They didn't want him in the room that day, and before the afternoon was over, every one of them would wish they had kept their mouths shut. October 3rd, 1965. Studio A, Columbia Records, New York City. The air inside the recording room hung thick with cigarette smoke and ego, curling around the heavy microphones and coiling in the yellow glow of the ceiling lights. Studio A had built reputations and broken them. Frank Sinatra had stood where the mic now waited. Jazz legends had shaped history in this very space. The floorboards carried the weight of American music, and the four men already seated around their instruments carried the quiet confidence of those who believed they belonged there. Eddie Marlowe adjusted the tuning pegs on his Gretsch, the chrome hardware catching the light as he leaned back in his chair. He'd been Columbia's first call for nearly 4 years, a guitarist who could sight-read anything placed in front of him and make it sound effortless. He had backed pop crooners, soul singers, television variety stars. He had played on records that spun endlessly on AM radio. Precision was his currency, and he was wealthy. Across from him, bassist Victor Kane rested his fingers on the neck of his Fender, plucking muted notes as if warming up for a polite conversation rather than a recording session. Victor prided himself on steadiness. Producers trusted him because he never overplayed, never drifted, never turned a song into something it wasn't meant to be. Behind the drum kit, Ron Feld tapped his sticks against the rim, a soft, metronomic tick that suggested discipline rather than flair. Ron believed in pocket, in restraint, in keeping the rhythm invisible so the singer could shine. At the upright piano, Harold Stein scanned a sheet of chord charts and adjusted his glasses, already thinking about voicings and transitions, about how to keep everything tasteful. They were professionals, and they knew it. They had built careers on the understanding that music was structure, arrangement, control. They represented the polish of New York craftsmanship, and they wore that identity like tailored suits. Which was why the thin kid sitting silently in the corner irritated them before he had even touched an instrument. He had arrived nearly an hour earlier with the producer, nodded once when introduced, and taken a seat near the wall without asking for coffee or making small talk. His jacket looked worn, suede scuffed at the elbows. His boots carried city dust. His hair seemed determined to ignore gravity. He didn't carry himself like a man entering a legendary studio. He looked more like someone who had wandered in from a coffee house in Greenwich Village and forgotten to leave. "That's the one," Eddie had asked quietly after the producer stepped out to take a call. Victor nodded. "Name's Bob Dylan. Folk singer. They say he wants to go electric." The word electric had landed between them like a challenge. Ron had chuckled. Another protest kid who thinks plugging in makes him revolutionary. Harold had given a faint sigh. Folk audiences don't want volume. They want purity. The kid in the corner hadn't reacted. He sat with his hands loosely folded, eyes scanning the room in a way that was not curious and not intimidated, just observant. That stillness unsettled Eddie more than bragging would have. Most young artists talked too much, tried too hard to impress session musicians, dropped names, quoted influences. This one said nothing. Silence in a studio usually meant insecurity. But his silence felt different. It felt deliberate. Eddie leaned back and spoke louder than necessary. "Been cutting records in this town since '61. Backed everyone worth backing. Haven't heard a folk singer yet who could handle a full band without hiding behind an acoustic." Ron grinned. 3 chords and a harmonica. That's the formula. Victor added, "They always think it's about feeling. But feeling without discipline is just noise." The kid shifted slightly, but kept his gaze low. If he heard them, he gave no sign. When the producer returned and clapped his hands together, the room straightened instinctively. "All right, gentlemen. We're trying something different today." He looked toward the corner. "Bob's got a new arrangement. We're going electric." Eddie exchanged a glance with Victor. "Does he know how to lead a band?" Eddie asked, only half joking. The producer hesitated. "He knows what he wants." That answer did not satisfy them. Knowing what you want and knowing how to get it in a studio were different things. The producer turned to the quiet figure by the wall. "Bob, you want to run through it?" The kid looked up, eyes clearer than any of them expected. "Sure," he said softly. No bravado. No hesitation. Just that one word. Eddie felt a flicker of annoyance he couldn't quite name. He preferred confidence he could measure, skill he could predict. This quiet certainty offered neither. Ron tapped his sticks once more. "We'll keep it simple," he muttered. "Ease him in." Victor adjusted his strap. Harold positioned his fingers above the keys. The white Stratocaster leaned against an amp near the center of the room, waiting like an unspoken test. Eddie followed the kid's gaze as it landed on the guitar. There was a brief pause, not long enough to call dramatic, but long enough to suggest wait. In that pause, none of them imagined the afternoon would redraw the boundaries of their understanding. They saw only a folk singer out of his depth, a gamble by a producer chasing trends. They did not see a shift approaching. They did not sense that the silence in the corner was not emptiness, but gathering storm. And when the kid finally rose from his chair and stepped toward the Stratocaster, moving with calm, unhurried steps that carried no trace of doubt, the foremost reliable musicians in New York prepared themselves to demonstrate, politely and professionally, the difference between raw ambition and real mastery, unaware that before the hour ended, the hierarchy of that room would tilt in a way none of them would ever forget. The moment he picked up the guitar, the room shifted in a way none of them could immediately explain. The white Stratocaster felt unfamiliar in his hands, lighter than his worn acoustic, colder somehow, but he adjusted the strap without comment and turned the volume knob slowly, as if testing not just the instrument but the air itself. Eddie watched with a faint smirk, fingers already forming the opening progression they had agreed on, a clean, controlled blues pattern designed to give the folk singer something safe to stand on. Victor rolled his shoulders and locked in beside him, steady and restrained. Ron counted them in with a soft click of sticks. Harold laid down gentle chords, tasteful and unobtrusive. It was tight, predictable, professional, exactly the kind of backing track that made singers sound better than they were. "Whenever you're ready," Eddie called, letting just enough amusement slip into his voice to be heard. The kid nodded once, stepped closer to the amplifier, and struck a chord. It wasn't flashy. It wasn't fast. But it wasn't careful either. The note rang out with a grain in it, a slight snarl that didn't sit neatly inside the progression Eddie had started. It bent against the structure instead of fitting inside it. Eddie frowned almost imperceptibly and continued playing, expecting the kid to fall into rhythm, to follow the path laid out for him. Instead, the next chord landed slightly ahead of the beat, not sloppy, not late, but pushing, as if the song were impatient with its own tempo. Ron adjusted instinctively, tightening his hi-hat to keep things anchored. Victor simplified his line. The kid moved his fingers along the fretboard with movements that looked casual but carried intention, sliding into notes instead of striking them clean, letting strings buzz just long enough to feel human. There was something unsettling about it. It wasn't technically dazzling. It wasn't the kind of solo that made session players nod in approval. It felt raw, like a thought spoken before it had been polished. Eddie increased his volume slightly, reasserting the progression, reminding the room who was steering. The kid answered with a sharper strum, this time allowing a touch of feedback to bloom and hang in the space between measures. Feedback was something engineers usually fought, something to eliminate. But he let it hover, shaped it, nudged it with the angle of the guitar until it sounded less like error and more like emphasis. Harold's hands hesitated above the keys. The air felt thicker now, charged in a way that made the fluorescent lights seem too bright. Then the kid stepped toward the microphone. He didn't announce himself. He didn't ask for levels. He just leaned in and sang. The voice that came out wasn't smooth. It cracked slightly at the edges, nasal and uneven. Nothing like the polished baritones that usually stood in that spot. But every word carried weight. He sang as if he weren't trying to impress anyone in the room, as if he were speaking to someone far beyond it. The lyrics tumbled forward, conversational but cutting, and the rhythm bent around the phrasing instead of controlling it. Eddie's right hand slowed. He found himself listening instead of leading. Ron felt his steady backbeat begin to feel stiff, almost mechanical, against the looseness of the vocal. Victor reduced his bass line to the simplest pulse he could manage. In less than half a minute, the careful arrangement they had prepared felt irrelevant. The kid wasn't rejecting their structure outright. He was dissolving it, piece by piece, with something more instinctive. He played a brief run up the neck, not clean, not symmetrical, but urgent, like a thought racing ahead of itself. The strings squealed faintly as he bent one note farther than Eddie would have dared on a studio take. It wavered, threatened to break, then settled into a tone that felt strangely triumphant. Ron stopped counting internally. Harold's chords faded into silence. Eddie's pick hovered above the strings as he realized he was no longer accompanying. He was witnessing. The kid closed his eyes for a second, riding the last vibration of the amp, then let his palm mute the strings abruptly. The room fell silent. Not the comfortable silence of musicians between takes, but a dense, almost disorienting quiet. He unplugged the cable carefully, looped it over the amp, and set the Stratocaster back where it had been, as if returning a borrowed book. Then he walked back to the chair in the corner and sat down, hands folded loosely in his lap. "That all right?" he asked, voice calm, almost shy again. No one answered immediately. Eddie became acutely aware of the cigarette burning between his fingers. Ron stared at his snare drum as if it had betrayed him. Victor cleared his throat, but found no words. Harold adjusted his glasses, even though they hadn't slipped. The temperature of the room felt different, warmer and sharper at the same time. What had just happened wasn't a display of superior technique. It wasn't virtuosity in the traditional sense. It was something harder to categorize. The kid had taken the rigid professionalism of Studio A and introduced uncertainty into it. He had shown them that imperfection could be deliberate, that rough edges could carry more truth than flawless execution. Eddie finally spoke, his voice lower than before. "Where'd you learn to play like that?" The kid shrugged slightly. "Just listening," he said. And somehow that answer unsettled them more than the performance itself. By the time the producer stepped back into Studio A, he didn't need anyone to explain that something had happened. He saw it in their faces. Eddie, usually composed to the point of arrogance, stood with his guitar hanging idle against his hip. Ron's drumsticks rested loosely across the snare, untouched. Victor avoided eye contact. Harold stared at the sheet music as if it had suddenly become outdated. And in the corner, the kid sat quietly again, the same unassuming figure who had walked in an hour earlier, as though the room hadn't just tilted on its axis. The session they had planned never unfolded the way it was supposed to. The neat arrangement was quietly abandoned. The tidy edges they had rehearsed felt unnecessary now, almost dishonest. Instead, they tried another take built around the kid's instinct rather than their structure. It wasn't cleaner. It wasn't safer. But it breathed. In the weeks that followed, the single climbed steadily, not because it sounded like everything else on the radio, but because it didn't. When Bob Dylan stepped onto bigger stages with an electric guitar slung over his shoulder, some audiences cheered and others protested, but nobody remained indifferent. The night he plugged in at the Newport Folk Festival, the reaction rippled far beyond the crowd. For many, it felt like betrayal. For others, it felt like a door being kicked open. But for the four-session men in Studio A, the revolution had already happened in private, in a smoke-filled room with no audience at all. Years later, Eddie would admit that the moment unsettled him more than any chart failure ever could. "I thought music was about control," he told a reporter long after the dust had settled. "About knowing exactly where every note belongs. That day I realized sometimes the note belongs where it wants to go." Ron practiced differently after that session. He left space where he once would have filled it. Victor listened harder, not just to tempo but to intention. Harold stopped dismissing rough drafts of songs before they had time to grow. None of them abandoned their professionalism. They didn't suddenly become reckless. But they understood something new. That mastery without risk was only half the story. The kid they hadn't wanted in the room never gloated, never reminded them of the shift he had sparked. He simply kept moving forward, writing, recording, challenging audiences who preferred comfort. And Studio A continued hosting polished sessions, just as it always had. But for those four men, there would always be a before and an after. Before the quiet folk singer picked up a borrowed Stratocaster. And after he showed them that rock wasn't born from perfection, but from conviction. They hadn't wanted him there that morning. By evening, they understood they had witnessed something far rarer than technical brilliance. They had watched the lines between genres blur, the rules bend, and a new voice step into its own without asking permission. And in the stillness that followed that first jagged chord, they learned that sometimes history doesn't announce itself with fanfare. Sometimes it simply plugs in, plays for 30 seconds, and changes everything.